All right, guys, here's what we'll do. I'm going to run through the class, what we're going to do in the class today. But firstly, let me welcome everybody and thank you for joining me today for 3D mobility to age-proof your body. We've got a what, why, how, when, a missing link, which I'll talk about, and then a Q&A section. So what we're going to do is we'll run through a little bit of a theoretical session component at the start. Then in the middle, I'm going to up and we'll start going through some of these movements that I want you guys to learn in a systematic progression. Don't stress too much if you don't memorize it all at the beginning, because we are going to record this and I can send it to you guys as well. Perfect. So let's start with the what. We need to understand, firstly, before we go into the stretches, a little bit about human anatomy and physiology. So I'm going to take you back to school and give you a little bit of a biology lesson to get you guys up to speed so that what we're talking about makes a little bit more sense. So the main thing I want to talk about in this session is three-dimensional movement. What that basically means is when we look at human movement, the body moves in three planes of motion. They're broken down into the sagittal plane, the frontal plane, and the transverse plane, which we have the pictures here for you guys, but again, it's not coming through very well. Now, the sagittal plane, this is where the body moves either forwards and backwards or up and down. This is the most dominant movement that we see in all of our workouts, especially in our stretching. Then the second plane of motion we have is something called the frontal plane. In the frontal plane, we move lateral, side to side. So anything that is away from the body in that lateral motion is what we're going to consider frontal plane. And the third one that we have is the transverse plane of motion. With transverse, I want you to think about anything that's twisting or rotational. So sagittal plane is forwards and backwards, up and down. Think like a squat or a step or a plank. A frontal plane motion is side to side. Think like a lateral lunge or a shoulder raise, side plank. And then the transverse plane is anything with rotation or twisting motion. Does that make sense for a very quick, very explosive run through on planes of motion? Perfect. So what we're actually going to do through this, guys, so that we can keep the flow of the class going, as questions arise, what I want you to do is put them into the chat group. Then at the end of the class, what we're actually going to do is go through all of those Q&A. We'll go through all of the answers for those questions. And then if anything else comes up after this, when you review the footage, I'll give you my personal details so you can reach out to me directly. Make sense?
Okay.
Perfect. All right, guys. So that's how we move. We move three-dimensional. The next thing we're going to look at are the type of stretch techniques. So what? Different types of stretch techniques. Now, if I ask you, what is a stretch? Most people are going to reply with a type of static stretch, but that is one form of stretching. In fact, we have a static stretch. There's a PNF stretch where we use contractions of muscles at end range to get greater range of motion. Ballet dancers and gymnastics use this type of stretch. We have active isolated stretches where we use opposing muscles around a joint to create a contraction to increase greater range of motion. And then we have dynamic stretching. And these are just a few. Now, the question is stretching and why. The question is always why. For what we're looking at today, the topic today of age-proofing your body, we're going to utilize something called dynamic stretching. And we're going to look at those dynamic stretches from both a local and a global standpoint. And what I mean by local and global is we'll look at how to do these dynamic stretches at a local position, so around a specific joint. And then we'll look at how to do these stretches globally, where we incorporate the whole body's movement system, which I'm going to refer to from now on as the kinetic chain. So kinetic meaning motion, chain meaning links together. And that's how we look at the body. A series of links lined up together to work in synergy together to create function. Because that's what we are. We're a highly functioning unit. We are not a sum of parts. So with the dynamic stretching that we're looking at today, we're going to be doing the local to global, so joint-based stretching, full dynamic, full body-based stretching. But we're also going to be utilizing things like gravity off-shifting or load off-shifting. And what that's going to do is create an element of instability. And that's one of the key parts of why we're doing that stretch today. So that's the what, how we move and the different types of stretch techniques. Then we're going to look at the why. So why are we going to utilize a 3D approach to our stretches, and why are we going to use a dynamic variation today to age-proof our body. Well, sadly, not just with stretching or mobility techniques, in fact, with all of our training, there is an extremely large focus on sagittal plane only movement. The problem with that is the most dominant plane of motion in the body is the transverse plane. The other issue is that we tend to find the most or the vast majority of injuries happen to people in either the frontal plane, side to side, or the transverse plane twisting, not the sagittal plane. So now as we're stretching and we're training, we're trying to develop the body on the one plane of motion where we're already at our strongest. And this is why new moves in particular, you guys know with our training, we do a lot of three-dimensional based movements. And this is one of the reasons why. The body is designed to move 3D, and we want to focus on that. If we know that we tend to have the most of our issues in the frontal and transverse plane, that's where we want to have a greater focus. The next reason why is because when we have reduced ranges of motion at a joint, that restricts our ability to optimize movement. If we look at that from a training perspective, restricted range of motion is going to change the movement pattern, which means we can't load it the way that we want to, and we're starting to load suboptimal movement patterns, which is what we never want to do. When it comes to mobility, we know that we have good ranges of motion in that forwards, backwards, sagittal plane. When it comes to shifting laterally and rotating, we're tending to find two big issues that we're having is that when we move this way, we don't A, have the range of motion through the joint to get in and out of these positions, and B, we don't have the ability to control and stabilize through them, hence why we're starting to use instability. So let me circle back for a second. Let's go back to the name. We're talking about age-proofing the body. And what we're tending to find is that as people are aging, in fact, even with young people, I had a friend just recently, very fit, works out all the time. We're talking about falls. As people are aging, they're falling. And this is actually killing a lot of people. My grandmother died from a fall. Having an impact on younger people. Now, as I was saying, someone I know a couple of weeks ago was running across the road and due to the situation she was in, had to instantly shift laterally, and she couldn't control or stabilize herself. She actually fell and hurt herself. And this is someone who's fit and strong. So what we're looking at with these stretches is about putting the body into a position stable and maintaining that stability through an unstable position, as well as creating greater ranges of motion through those joints in those three planes of motion. So to recap that, we're looking at developing 3D mobility for 3D stability and optimal strength control through those greater ranges of motion. You guys following along so far? This is getting pretty deep. I'll bring it back up shortly. Perfect. Again, questions, fire them away in the chat group. The last thing we're looking at, I spoke in the description of this class about having an impact on the nervous system. When we start going through these moves, I'll explain this a little bit more, but to give you insight, these patterns that we're putting you into are creating a source of instability. So now what's happening is the brain's learning how to A, get into these positions, B, control them, and then C, get back out of them, which is exactly what a fall is. A fall is an unpredicted, unsuspected change of position in space. And the reason why we're falling is because we can't control that new position. That means the brain is unaware of its new place in space and it can't control it. And when we add momentum to the equation, we lose stability and fall. So by utilizing this 3D mobility, if not eliminate the chance and risk of those falls from happening. And the last thing we're looking at is the reason why we're going from local to global is because what I said earlier, the body is a chain reaction. It's a sequence and series when combined together into a functioning unit. But sometimes we need to have a greater focus on a local area. And this is why we go local to global. We start with the smaller area, create the greater range of motion and then integrate it back into that body's full chain reaction and movement pattern. Make sense? All right. So that's the what and the why of what we're going through today. Now we get to go through the how. So get some space and we're going to go through this. Now, while you're getting some space and you're getting ready and set up, this pattern today is set up in a 3-step. The first one is floor-based. So all of the movements we'll do from the floor. The second positioning is from a half kneeling position. So we're starting to come up a little bit more. And as we come further away from the ground, we start to lose stability. So there's going to be greater work involved. Now, the reason why we're starting on the floor as well is because as we start to get older, getting up and down off the floor is really tough. So I wanted to start here and integrate this first before we brought it up into the standing pull positions. Now, if I can get everybody seated in this position like this for me, with your knees out to the side and your feet tucked off. Guys, does anyone have any knee issues or any injuries that I need to focus on today while we go through this? Okay, perfect. If there's anything that you can't do, don't worry about it. Some of these moves are a little bit difficult, but it's something for you to work towards. This is why we're recording this. We can give this to you guys, and you can go back and play this back over and work through it. All right, guys, so from this position first, I'm going to go inside a little bit so you can see me a little bit more. From this position, guys, the first thing I want you to do is bring your chest down to the outside knee. Then as we do that, I want you to take that same arm. So I'm leaning on my left knee and I'm taking my right arm and I'm reaching it up and off to the side. And as I do that reach, I should feel a big stretch down in underneath that armpit. Now that muscle there runs directly into that glute that we're stretching on the opposite side. That's a chain reaction in the body that we see every time we walk. Those opposing muscles from shoulder to glute contract to create rotation. So when we come down, we're creating a stretch through those muscles that contract when we do daily functional walking. From here, let's take those knees over. We're going to roll to the other side. From here, once we've done that, we'll bring the chest down and that hand out, and we'll reach it out in front of us again. Perfect. Then from there, come back up. And what we're actually going to do is we're just going to roll from side to side now, reaching. And when we get to end range, we are not going to stay there. We're going to come back. And each time you shift, you should be able to reach a little bit further away, and you should be able to get a little bit deeper and closer to that leg. We can just do a couple more. Guys, can I ask you to mute your microphone through this? And then if you really need to ask a question, you can turn it back on and ask away. Perfect. Last one is we're going to come back over to the other side again, reach all the way over and come back. Now, I want to create a bit of a shortening and lengthening of those glutes. So from this position, they kind of stretch. From here, what I want you to do is pop up to the knees. Beautiful. Sit back, rock, and pop up again. And we're going to continue this rolling and shifting because we shorten the glute, and then we're going to lengthen it as we come back down, roll. And every bit of this movement is now starting to not only take the hip joint that we're focusing on, but the rest of the body through three-dimensional stretching in all those planes of motion. Now from here, we got to work on the back of the hamstrings as well. So what I want you to do is just roll the hip and straighten the legs. And you'll notice mine at the moment, there's a big gap between my knee and the floor. So my hamstrings are a little bit tight. Let's pull back into the other side. Now you watch as we start to progress through this, as we open up and shift back in, by the third or fourth rep for me, that range of motion will be opened up. And if you see now, my knees are on the floor. So I've already increased that range of motion organically through the hamstrings. And then as we keep going through this, I can go even further by squeezing the quads in this section, shift back. Legs straight, squeeze the quads in this section, and shift back. Guys, we'll do two more. Squeezing those quads and straightening the leg. Last one. Forward and back in. Perfect, guys. From here, what I want to do is we're going to go into all fours. This is going to be a little bit weird. I'm trying to figure out the best angle for this without putting my bum in your face. All right. So I want you in hands and knees. I want your shoulder stacked over your wrist. And I want your hip stacked over your knee. From that position. Hey, can you mute me your microphone, please?
Oh, sorry.
No problem, man. Okay, guys, from here, what I want you to do is we're going to squeeze this shoulder towards this hip. And that's created a lateral or frontal plane bend of the spine. From there, we'll shift off to the other side. And I want you to keep your shoulders over your wrists, your hips over your knees as you create that squeeze and shift. And as we move into each rep of this, we should start to get some greater range of motion. So now we're getting a slight core workout while we're getting a stretch and mobilizing that spine. Perfect. Let's bring it back to neutral. From here, now we're going to go into the sagittal plane. So we're going to squeeze through the tummy and create a cat. From there, we're going to relax the tummy, squeeze through the back, and arch up. And I want you to tuck your chin and bring your chin up as you extend it back. We'll just do a couple more of these, guys. 3, 2, and 1. Now from here, we're going to lift one hand off the ground. We're going to take that hand underneath as far as we can. Then when we hit that end range, we're going to come, open up, reach as high towards the sky as we can. Then as we again continue through these repetitions, your range of motion should start to increase. As you open up to the sky, you should feel a stretch through the chest, through the front of the shoulder and the tummy. And as you reach underneath, you should be starting to feel that stretch towards the back of the shoulder and across the back. And we'll do one more before we change sides. Through, open all the way up. And let's change hands, guys. So we'll shift, reach in underneath. Don't push it too hard, the first one. Just find that end range and open up. Let's move a little bit further. That range should increase. And so we're using movement to increase range of motion. What that's doing is it's sending a response to the nervous system to release some of the tension in the muscle, give us greater range of motion, because the brain is starting to understand that it can, A, get into and out of these positions safely. Therefore, I'll give you more to work with. And when you can control that, I'll give you a little bit more. So it's a slightly different theoretical approach than a static stretch, which is just aggressively pull tension on the tissue. Now we're starting to use the body we're starting to use, I guess, the magic of the body to sort of give us back what we're looking for. Perfect. Guys, from there, we're going to move back into a seated position. Those of you who are doing our classes know this one very well. What we're going to do here is we're actually going to focus on stretching the front of the hips. Now, with us sitting at home all day, these are getting really, really, really tight. So by creating contraction through the glute, this will help release this muscle. It's something called reciprocal inhibition. They're parent muscles on opposite sides of the joint. When one contracts, one must release. So by coming into this extension and contracting that glute, that's sending a signal to the nervous system to release this muscle so we can get that joint range of motion. So let's start feet planted. We'll go left hand on the floor behind us, arm straight. And then take our right hand, bring the elbow in between our legs. As we come up off the ground, we're going to take our right hand, reach it toward that left, squeeze our right glute as much as we can, and come back down. Now it's at that end range where you squeeze that glute that it's going to give us that tissue release. Now as we go through these, you'll find that range will increase each rep. Let's do 5 more. Ready? Up we go. Squeezing that right glute, getting that hip as high as you can, back down and touch. Hit it up again. We'll go reach, back down. There's 2. Make sure you're really trying to open that hip up. That's our focus here. 3, keep going for 2 more. Now, even though the hip, keep going. When with that hand reach, we are also lats or those muscles along the back as well. Perfect, guys. Excuse me. Beautiful. I think that might work for those on the floor.
It went through on the floor.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm back. How do you feel about those 3? Everyone okay with them?
Yes.
Perfect. Let's up the ante a little bit more. From here, let's go to half kneeling. I'll try to get this camera right. All right, guys. So from this half kneeling position, what we're going to do to start off with is focus on opening up the front of this hip, as well as the back of this hip. Now on this leg, on the front leg, what we're actually going to do at the same time is open up the back of this side. So we are opening up down the front of this leg while we are opening up the back of this leg. And we're going to go through this stretch in 3 planes of motion. Let's start with the most common one. We'll go sagittal plane first. So in that half kneeling position, what I want you to do is shift forward until you feel the stretch here. Don't worry about getting range and taking it through your back. Focus on just shifting to the end range of your hip. Then from there, I want you to shift back to your heel and stretch that hamstring. Now we're not going to hold these again, we're moving through and shifting back. Now this time as you come up, I want you to really squeeze your glute to try and open that hip. And as you come down, you're going to squeeze your quad to open up the hamstring. Squeezing the glute, quad, glute, and quad. Now from here, what we're going to do is add some hand drivers. Why are we going to do that? Well, it's starting to take the stretch from local positions to global movement. And these hand drivers are also going to add an element of instability while starting to get mobility through the shoulder girdle and the T-spine and work on some core strength. So from here, as we shift forward, we're going to drive our hands up overhead. And then we'll shift back down, hands back as we flex through. Shift all the way up as we reach up and drop back through. Remember those muscle contractions, and remember each repetition is supposed to increase that range of motion. 2 and 1. Let's change legs, guys. Let's go the other side now. So start to progress that range of motion. Take your time with it. So let's shift forward, just finding that M range of the hip, not through the back and shifting down. Come up through and shift back down. We'll do one more, shifting through, back down to that leg straight. Now let's add the hand drivers. Let's go all the way up, big reach overhead. Let's shift down and get as straight as we can. All the way up overhead, coming all the way down, nice and flat. Now really swing your arms a little bit more, add more momentum. The more momentum you add, the more it's going to challenge the nervous system and your center of gravity or your stability. Good, guys. 2 and 1. Perfect. So we did the sagittal plane. Now let's do the frontal plane. Sagittal plane was forward, backwards, up and down. Frontal plane side to side. So back in that half kneeling position again, I want you to start with your hands on your hip. I want you to make sure that front foot is out just a little bit. So now we're a bit stronger, but do not turn that foot out. Make sure the foot's still straight. Hands on the hips. First thing I want you to do is shift all the way over here. And we're working on the inside of that hip. Then we're going to shift all the way this way. We should start to feel that into our glute just a little bit. Let's go again, shifting sideways. And out again. Make sure you're starting to feel that stretch on the inside of that kneeling knee, on the outside of that kneeling knee. Let's add some hand drivers. So that's going to help increase that range of motion even more now. It's going to add a greater element of instability. Good, guys. Keep going for me. 3. Really shift those hips. Use that momentum of the arm to shift them. 1 more. That looks good, guys. Let's change legs. So again, come into that kneeling position. Open up a little bit. Hands on your hip. Feel it out first. Open the inside, shifting. And then close it, feeling it on the lateral outside of that hip. Opening. Closing. Each rep should give you a little bit more range of motion. Tick, looking good. Shift. Good, guys. Let's add those hand drivers now. And if you start to play with speed a little bit as well, that's going to have a greater impact on that brain or the nervous system's ability to keep stability and control the body in space. Do 2 and 1. So we've done sagittal plane, frontal plane. The last one we have is transverse twisting. A little bit hard to do on the hip, but if we incorporate hand drivers, we definitely can. Now, where you set the kneeling leg depends on whether you were trying to focus on creating greater internal or external rotation. We could either set the leg at a different starting position, but for tonight, let's just set it in a neutral position. From here, the other foot is neutral. Make sure we're stable. From here, what we're going to do is rotate over that lead leg. And you should start to feel a little bit of a stretch, sort of twisting inside of that hip. Then we're going to go the other way. And you'll feel that shift into the inside of this one, and a little bit on the outside of the other one. And from here, now what I want you to do is not only focus on going as far as you can through those rotations to feel it in the hip, but add speed. Add that element of instability. Now, where else can you guys feel that? In around that midsection, right? All of those rotations you're doing are not just impacting the hip. They're impacting how the spine is mobile in relation to that hip. Rest. Let me give you guys a little bit of an example. When we're talking about how falls are impacting people and how this is going to help you. Let's say, for example, I'm moving forwards and all of a sudden I have to move laterally to get out of the way and take off somewhere. Now, if I haven't, learned to be able to shift into this leg, which is another topic, but rotate into it, so enough rotation through this hip and the knee and ankle to be able to sit down, decelerate, slow, and control myself. This hip is open as well for me to then come out of there and carry on. If I don't have those things, what will happen is when I get into that position, I'll get to my end range of mobility, but I still have momentum. And that momentum shift comes through, and that's where your falls end up coming through. So by adding that bit of speed to these movements, we're developing stability, dynamic stability in all three planes of motion. It's exactly what you need to be able to mitigate or eliminate those falls and chances of risk, or the risk of falls, sorry. Cool, so I think that's your kneeling. One last thing I'm going to give you on the kneeling. When we did the hand drivers, we drove the hands in the same plane of motion that we were driving the hips. You can change that. I might do sagittal plane through the hips, but I might add transverse rotation through the spine to start to create a momentum shift off my center of gravity while moving in a sagittal plane. That to me is developing that skill set is immediately going to eliminate those chances of risk of falls. So for example, we could rotate. I could even add my frontal plane motion instead. Or I could go into my frontal plane hip motion with sagittal plane drivers. It's up to you. What I want to give you is the tools for you to play with it. And when we get to when to do this, how often, I'll explain to you a little bit more about that. All right, guys, so we've gone from seated. Then we came to kneeling. Now let's put it all together into what we really need, which is the standing version. So jump up for me. Perfect. You guys can see me okay?
Yeah.
Good stuff. All right, so in sticking with the trend, we're going to start in a sagittal plane of motion. So what I want you to do is get your feet underneath your hip. And then I want you to step forward with your left foot. Now, your left foot is going to continuously step forwards and backwards throughout this. Your right foot will not move its position. But the tricky part is, every time you move forward, you're going to shift your weight onto the left foot. And when you move backwards, you're going to actually, kind of tricky. It looks easy, but it's tricky. You're going to shift that weight back onto the left foot. Forward onto the left foot, back onto the left foot. Okay, so let me explain the stretch now. As we come forward, we're actually doing a more global version of the kneeling one that we did. But because we're adding locomotion or movement in the human body, that movement is having a big impact on our stability. When we throw our hands around, now the brain is going to help the body control and maintain that position while giving us those greater ranges of motion. So let's go sagittal plane first. We're going to step forward, feel a big stretch down the front of the hip, and now we should feel it in the quad as well. And then we're going to drive our hands overhead. Then from there, we're going to come back and shift back onto that left foot, keeping the right leg straight, and we'll swing the arms down. When we do this, we should feel a big stretch all the way down the back of the right leg. Then we'll come up, shift forward, open, back. So we're going what we actually call an anterior and posterior chain stretch. That basically just means all the muscles down the front of the body that work together and all the muscles down the back of the body that work together. 2 and 1. Guys, let's change legs. So now the left foot's got to stay stuck in place. The right foot's doing the moving. Let's step forward. Let's shift and open. Feel that stretch through the front of the hip and the quads. Step back, shift back onto the right foot. Swing the arms down, stretch the back of the leg. Come forward, open, and back. If you're not getting that stretch down the front of the hip and the quad, take a bigger step. That'll definitely open it up for you. Make sure that front leg is straight when you step backwards so you can get that stretch. Go 2 more. 1. And time, guys, perfect. That was sagittal. Let's go frontal. So we'll lock the right leg in again first, and we're going to step over that right leg with the left leg. So the left leg has come over in front of the right leg. You're going to shift all your weight away from that right foot, putting the pressure into the outside of the right foot, feeling the stretch on the outside of the hip. Then from there, we'll take that left foot step back. We're going to go wide. Now we're keeping that right leg straight, and we're shifting into that left leg and opening the stretch up the inside of that leg. Over, opening up the back of the hip, and step and shift. Good. Now let's increase this range of motion by adding hand drivers. Now guys, let me ask you a quick question while we're doing these. Do these look and potentially feel like positions that you might end up in while you're falling? Now, if I don't have good mobility here, I can't get that foot over to get out. So as I'm falling, I can only get to here, momentum comes, bang, I'm down. Or vice versa this way. So again, not only are we going through these for the mobility and range of motion at the joints, we're also going through this for the brain's ability to control the body in space. So that was your frontal on the right leg. Let's go to the left. Take that right leg over the left. Shift that left hip out to the left. Don't add hand drivers yet. And step. You can lean a little bit. So the outside of that hip, inside. Start to go a little bit deeper in those ranges. And let's add some hand drivers now. And if you start to play with speed a little bit too, you guys will start to feel and understand the instability aspect that we're talking about. 2. And 1. Perfect. We've done sagittal. We just did frontal. Now we need to do transverse. So what we're going to do for this, we'll lock that right leg in again. Left leg over the top. Now what is crucial here? See my right foot. It is not going to move. As I step over, it does not turn. It stays locked in place. So as I step over, I'm only stepping over as far as this hip's going to allow me to internally rotate. When you find that end range stop, come back out. And then as we go back in and out over these, the range will increase. So as we cross over here, internal, we should feel it through the back of the glute. As well, a little bit of pressure on the inside of the hip. And then as we open up, we feel it start to open up the front inside of that hip. Then as we start to add those hand drivers, that's going to help us, with my power cage, sorry guys, that's going to help us create more range of motion. Again, these are also positions we end up in falls, but by going through it here, again, we're giving you that capability to get into and out of these positions. Falls come from the inability to either A, access these ranges and or B, control them. Just with these stretches, you're getting both. Beautiful. Now, again with these, I did them all in their singular planes. But the human body doesn't actually work like that. The human body works in all 3 planes of motion at once. The question is, based on the movement, how much of each plane is being accessed at each part of the body? And by each part, I'm talking about the joints. So what we actually want to start doing with these, once we've mastered them in their individual planes, you want to integrate the planes of motion. So for example, if I'm doing the sagittal plane step forward and back, if I start adding a frontal transverse plane driver with my hands, as I'm starting to come in and open, I add that extra bit of driver, and now what I'm creating is more instability and more range of motion through that spine that I'm learning to control. The more I can expand on that capability, the more I eliminate or mitigate that possibility. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, so they're the three positional pathways I want you guys to go through and play with. You've got the seated positioning, where we're focusing on mostly the hips and the spine, and we're stretching the glutes, the quads, we're working through some of the abdominal muscles, and the major one in the upper body is the big lats, the big muscle on the back. That tends to get really tight because that big muscle on the back creates what we call internal rotation of the shoulder. When we sit all the time, we end up here, and that actually creates a lot of tension in that lat. So by creating that range of motion through there, that starts to open up and rectify back pain, shoulder issues, a whole host of things. So there's a really big expansion of the potential pathways of this stuff. But what I've tried to do is open you up to the ground level to at least get you to understand and expose you to that and let you experience it. And then from there, we can actually start to go into series of these, or I can create some informational videos and things like that to go out from here so that this information doesn't come to you in vain, or at least the one thing that frustrates me when information goes out is it's either A, too simplified, or B, limited. And one thing we've always tried to do is shy away from that, because simplicity is always good, but there's a complexity of things as well. And I don't think that we should shy away from sharing that with people. So one thing I always try to make sure when we go through educational stuff is that there's a growth pathway for people that isn't either A, restricted or dictated by the way I've delivered it. In fact, the pathway that you go with this will be decided by what you want to gain out of it. And that might not make any sense yet, but as you start to play with it a little bit more and experience for yourself the benefits from this, it might inspire some thinking and some questions that come up. And when that happens, I encourage you to reach out for me, and I'm happy to send you guys some stuff through, or even go to a quick call to chat about how you can take this further for yourself and what you're doing. Okay, so the next thing we have on here is when. When should you do this and how much of it can you do? The really good thing is, unlike a workout, this isn't overly stressful on the tissue that we're working or the nervous system that we're trying to impact. So what that means is that you recover and adapt pretty quickly. So that's a good thing, but it's also a double-edged sword. With it being so quick to adapt, it's also so quick to be lost. So the key to this is consistency. I mean, I think the key to anything that requires success in life is consistency. Just turning up, you know, and I don't mind if you turn up and do a 20% effort or 100%. I think just turning up and keeping consistent with it's going to be the big thing. So with movements like this, you don't have to get up and spend half an hour as we have going through a big section and the whole pathway like this. You might just pick a few movements that you do before and after each workout, or, you know, when you get a chance to get up from your desk at the office, or when you're stuck at home. For those of you that do a lot of dynamic sports like running, or I know a lot of you play tennis and things like that as well, my suggestion is this: shy away from static stretching prior to your sport. And the reason why I say this is initially because of common sense. We're preparing for movement, so why would we be static? To prepare to move, I believe we should get moving. Secondary to that, we also have a lot of data and evidence out there that says that when we take a muscle through a static stretch and we prolong that stretch for the 30 seconds that's required plus, what it actually does is slow down the speed at which that muscle can fire, the amount of force that muscle can produce for up to 4 hours afterwards. So I don't mind what you guys do post-workout, but my personal suggestion to everybody is move in preparation to move. So if you're pre-workout, start to look at the patterns that you might see. If it's running, focus on an arm drive, a rotation through the spine, opening up the hips, getting the back of the hip open up as the knee comes up. If it's tennis, think about lunging laterally, turning through the body, starting to use hand reaches to open up and play with the spine. This is going to have a direct impact on the brain, which is through the nervous system, controls everything that we do. And so this is going to give you a greater benefit in preparing to move. So move in preparation to move. And you can utilize all of these or some of these, and you can reach out to me and I can give you some more specific ones as well. Post-workout, my personal suggestion is do what you love. If you love to lay down and stretch after a workout, do it. If you don't want to do it and you want to just walk home and have a shower, go for that as well. Do what you love, because it's not going to hurt you. But doing something you don't like might. So to get back to when, do this as often as you can. We're all pretty active people here. I would say you guys are all doing something pretty much every day. So you sprinkle some of this stuff into your movement preparations before you work out. And I promise you guys, you will see some of the benefits of this stuff and pretty rapidly as well. In fact, some of the benefits you, I hope, will never see because you're never going to end up falling. All right. So there's one last thing I've got up here for you guys, which is the missing link. Now that missing link kind of comes back to not the mobility that we were going through today, but it talks more to the heart of the topic at hand, which is fall prevention. And making sure we kind of bulletproof not only our body, but how well that body moves and functions, not only as we age, because I mean, I'm already seeing the impacts now. So that last missing link, when it comes to injuries, we know that those falls aren't happening in the sagittal plane, but we focus on all our workouts. They're happening in the frontal plane and transverse plane, and they're the movement pathways that we miss a lot in everything. So that's the first part. The missing link that I'm talking about, though, is the ability to what we call decelerate or reduce speed. So for example, if I come down from a jump, how well I can decelerate and control myself. Or if I'm falling, how well can I decelerate and slow my movement down. Now, the reason why I talk about that, because if we go back to the heart of the topic, which is fall prevention, we know that the vast majority of falls and injuries happen because of an inability to decelerate or control their body through a braking, decelerative, slowing way. And things like joints start to go, or the impact from the fall will bother you. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because it's going to actually refer back to your training as well. In your training, everybody's walking on force production, but no one walks on force reduction. So the missing link in this fall thing is the first element was your ability to have those ranges of motion in the body three-dimensionally and be able to control, decelerate, stabilize, and get out of them. The second one is that deceleration. So to follow up to this next week, we're going to run through a webinar again on deceleration in 3 planes of motion and how you can either A, directly apply it to your training now, or for those of you that are coaches, how you can utilize that with your coach, with your clientele. For me, everybody has a parent or a grandparent. I lost my grandmother to a fall, and knowing that we could have utilized some of this stuff to prevent that, I think is pretty powerful. So this isn't just for you. This is also for the people around you. Now, you don't have to necessarily get those ones around you to do those crazy things that we just did, but take the concept of what I taught you, which is moving in and out of these 3 planes of motion, these obscure positions that we need to be able to control, but we are losing the ability to control. And I know in nursing homes, we've done things like simple as playing tic-tac-toe on a chalkboard, but we positioned the chalkboard in a position where they had to lean and reach. And by doing that, we created instability elements in 3 planes of motion that they had to control. And over time, we would increase the scope or the difficulty of those movements we were asking of them, but through a slightly more enjoyable and challenging way. So again, I want you guys to see much more today than just the movements that we did. I want you to take away, the essence of what we were talking about, understanding 3 dimensions, understanding the causes of falls and how we can prevent them, and how we can take this understanding of 3D movement to have a greater impact on not only ourselves and how we move, but the quality of the life of those around us. With a bit of creativity, you can turn this into something fun. Cool. All right, guys, that's what I've got for you. Now let's open it up to you guys. Let's go through some Q&A. Okay, so first one here from Ellen. Are people born with certain mobility? I noticed that my hips are tight and I don't have a great range of motion, my legs, while other people can easily move about. Yes and no. you can be born with a certain type of bone structure that will specifically limit, in particular, how the hips function. To give you a little bit of insight, let me just move this out of the way so I can see you guys. I've got a picture of this. Ellen, remind me to send it to you. Message me after this. I'll send you the picture. It's kind of creepy because it's of hips and femurs, but it gives a really good bit of insight of what I'm talking about. So if we look at the pelvis, I'm going to talk about restricted range of motion due to genetics from birth. When we look at the hip, we've got the pelvis. And when we look at the pelvis, I talk about the Mickey Mouse ears, right? So you've got your pelvis here, and these bones at the back here splay out, and they kind of look like Mickey Mouse ears. Now, the femur, or your thigh bone, your leg bone, comes up, and it kind of has a head on it like this. So the bone comes up, there's a little bit of a neck, and then you've got that big ball, and that's the head of the femur. And that sits into the socket joint of the hip. Now, where that socket joint of the is placed on the hip, on the pelvis, dictates drastically the amount of motion that you're going to have in frontal, sagittal, and transverse plane. If it's really out to the side, you're going to have greater ranges of motion through what we call abduction, or doing the splits. But when it comes to trying to get your hips closer together, you structurally cannot go anywhere because the edge of that socket will start to hit on the femur bone. So yes, you can be born with certain structural setup that can restrict ranges of motion. The statistics on it, I don't know for sure, but I don't know if I trust them either. I mean, I don't know how many hips we've actually, if we actually x-rayed everybody's hips, and if we've kept a record of this. But we know that there is a spectrum. I mean, our skeletal systems are all pretty much the same, fundamentally, but there are slight differentials in it based off of genetics. And that will have an impact on the way people move. Now, I said no as well. And the reason why I said no as well is because most of the time, most people have utilized data techniques to get range of motion. Now, static stretching does have a place for range of motion, but it's not what I use, because when most people come to me and they say, hey, for example, hey, I've got restricted range of motion in my hip, they've generally done a lot of static stretch. The reason why I won't use it is because they've done a lot and it's obviously not working. So we'll take a different approach. And this is where I'll utilize stretches that incorporate the nervous system. So that's when we can utilize a PNF stretch. We can utilize dynamic stretching, things like that. And if that's unsuccessful, then I'd normally be like, all right, let's see what we've got to work with, and then let's work within those confines. Does that help, Ellen? Beautiful. Okay, next one we got Mary. The last one on the floor. What's more important, the height of the hips or the length of the arm? Mary, was that this one? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, both. Initially, okay, so I'll talk. Guys, I'm going to go a little bit deep. Mary's actually a coach, and she studied with me a lot. So what are you looking at? What's the intended purpose of it? Because you know someone may have both tight lats and tight hip abductors. So my question at that point would be, what's the greatest priority? Is the hip causing the biggest issue, or is the lat? So is she's having shoulder issues or knee pains? If she's getting shoulder issues, I'd work on the lat first. Now, by releasing the lat, it's automatically going to help open up the hip flexor a little bit more, but there's got to be a hierarchy of priority. And so just go back to that question of, just do that hierarchy, that question of hierarchy. Go through that process again, and that'll sort of answer that question for you. But those are the two main points we're sort of looking at anyway as well, is the hip and the shoulder. But then you can just, you can prioritize. Sylvia, to build on Ellen's question, can nutrition help improve mobility or not? If so, what recommendation do you have? Okay, so there's a biopsychosocial model we look at when it comes to clinical work. And the biopsychosocial model takes into account when we're dealing with anything, movement, injuries, we need to look at it from a greater perspective. We need to look at it from a biological standpoint. So what's actually happening physiologically within the body. We need to look at the psychological standpoint of the person that's in front of us. And anyone here who's a coach knows that that doesn't just stand true in a clinical standpoint, it's also the same in a gym. And then there's a social model. I mean, what economic standpoint does this person come from? What are the stresses that come from that? What are the restrictions that come from that? So I guess what I'm trying to say is you need to look at everything, because I do not believe anything in isolation will ever do well. It's the same as in the gym. If you're looking at getting results and you train like a monster, but you eat like rubbish and you don't ever rest, you'll never get a result. You know, you need to, there's a harmony of things that come together. So my recommendation, go see a qualified dietitian. Be suspicious of nutritionists. A nutritionist is, I mean, it's just a certification. There's no real, I guess, safety net behind it. The dietitian is qualified. They've gone through 4 years of university. Now, I'm someone who's never been to university myself, but I'm at a certain level with things. So the reason why I share that with you is don't always just write it off, but be skeptical and at least, you know, inquire, get referrals. I mean, definitely when it comes to a clinical thing like this, get referrals. And there's a dietitian that I refer to if anyone's interested. But when it comes to nutrition, if you want to be serious, go deal with someone serious and don't listen to me. What do we got here? Sylvia, do you think yoga can help? Depends. I think it depends. We work with, I'll give you a couple examples. We work with a lot of professional athletes, in particular, a lot of grapplers and fighters. And I've barred all of our athletes that are grapplers from doing any type of yoga because the static holds in yoga are impacting their ranges of motion, and they were getting muscle injuries throughout like training and competition. So in that scenario, I would say, no, I don't see it having an impact. In fact, I think that I could create something that would be a little bit beneficial for them. On the other hand, I've got another client, she's just a housewife. She had mobility issues. She absolutely hates going to the gym. She hates training. And she got inspired to try a little bit of yoga to try and help with her mobility and core strength. And she absolutely loves it. And because she loved it, she was able to go a little bit more consistently. And I think that consistency and the enjoyment, so the psychological element, had a direct impact on it. So for yoga can help, yes or no? My answer would be, do you want to do yoga and do you enjoy it? If the answer to that is yes, then I would say get stuck in and find a really good class or coach to work with. Can too much flexibility be a problem for Mia? 100%. This is one of the biggest issues with static stretching. If you create greater range of motion at the joint, you now need to teach the nervous system how to control that range of motion. Otherwise, all you've done is create an unstable platform to work on. This is again why I don't just utilize static stretching. In fact, static stretching has a very, very, very small role to play in the stretching techniques that I utilize. It's mostly utilized in a rehabilitative standpoint for someone who's come out post-surgery or things like that, and I need to get immediate range of motion back through a joint. After that, it's all about going in and out of those ranges with movement so that the nervous system can start to understand and control them. And as you increase them over time, it is not only giving you that range, but it's giving you the strength and control over it. So too much flexibility can be a problem. We tend to find that too much flexibility being a problem is normally only an issue based off of two things that I can think of right now. The first one being the wrong technique applied to create that range of motion, or that technique missing elements to be able to give you the ability to control that range of motion. The second thing is some people are born with hypermobility. When that comes into play, we add a lot of strength work, a lot of 3D mobility work, because we don't just have to tighten the tissue there. It's not just about creating tight tissues. Again, it's about teaching the brain to be able to fire that tissue in a functioning way so that it can create the movement that we're after, or control the movement that we're after to maintain stability or function or whatever it is that we're looking for. So yes, flexibility can be a problem, but if we develop the control through those ranges of motion, then it's not a problem at all. When it comes back, that makes me think of a question. My question that I'll ask myself for you guys is, how much range of motion do I need, or how much flexibility do I need? And the answer to that's going to be, it depends. I know some people come to me and they're like, we want to be able to do the splits. I'm like, that's fantastic. Why? And if it's just because that's a goal of mine, great, then we'll work on it. If it's because, well, isn't that the range I need? I'll normally be like, no. Let's talk about what you do. And from there, we can figure out ranges of motion that are applicable to you. So don't get caught up in the idea that we want to get more range of motion. What we're looking at trying to do is create relative range of motion or enough range of motion for us to be able to do the things that we're trying to do while teaching the nervous system to control our body's ability to maintain our equilibrium or our balance within space through those positions. Does that help, Mia? Is that good? Perfect. Grace, my parents have really terrible balance and coordination. What would be the best way to help get them started with improving these issues? Grace, that's a great question. I had the same issue with my in-laws. We went on a holiday to Japan. I noticed one time we were on a bus. Their ability to walk up and down the hallway of that bus did not exist. And they were only in their 60s at the time. Now, the good news is you can have a direct impact on it straight away. And you can use what I was talking about where we worked with people before in nursing homes. And we utilized we did silly stuff. We blew up balloons. We just hit them back and forth because now there's a cognitive impact as well. And there's an off shift with an amount of force production. We did paintings, like anything, but it was all from a standing position, right? So here's what they have. They've got forwards and backwards. They're really good at that, I would say, right, Grace? Okay, so the issue is going to be side to side and twisting. So the first thing I would end up doing is I would just work through some of those footprints that we were doing earlier. And you could turn this into a game, or you could even you can even get a video game form with those dance mats. This is actually like a legitimate way to do it. And what I'd be looking at is creating frontal plane pat. And all we're doing is crossing the feet and shifting because this is what people are. So if I can even just start by getting here and coming back and moving away a little bit and back and here and back, it's twist and back, things like this. And then you just start to expand on that from there. You can incorporate so much. Try to make it meaningful, not demanding. This doesn't want to be a chore because, again, we want it to be consistent.
That balance with your parents, isn't it? Because I was trying to teach them, that the simple move that you guys always do with the left and right this.
Mm-hmm.
I told my dad, oh, your hands to the left and your feet to the right. And he started off like that, and then it just ends up going the same
way, right? Yeah.
Really frustrating. And just simple things he just can't get. So yeah, maybe I'll just try with the...
Do you know what, with that jumping one that you just did, a really easy way to integrate it is step, twist, step, twist. So now I'm stepping forward and twisting over the lead leg. Then to make it more challenging, step back. Then we can start even adding the step and twist. I would just add a matrix of footprint stepping patterns in a sagittal, frontal, and transverse way, and then just add rotational hand drivers the whole time. Because when we're walking, we're always rotating through here. As I step with the right leg, my left arm swings. That's a rotation. And then rotation and rotation. So every time this rotation is happening, there's a new equilibrium or state of balance that my brain has to find. So if you start to do those stepping pathways through the 3 planes of motion while adding those rotational hand drivers, that alone will have a drastic impact. And then from there, you can start playing with environmental factors like adding steps, changing the actual foot position, creating as much instability through the body as possible and making control. I wouldn't worry even about ranges of motion to start off with. Just get them to maintain stability through those different potential footprint patterns.
Cool, thank you.
My pleasure. Mary, this makes a lot of sense. I trained for months to be able to do the splits and never succeeded. Yeah, we had the same issue with Dylan. And we used movement to bring it back. Look, one thing I'm not trying to do here is write off static stretching. Let's go back to what I said at the start. There's always a why. We've got to ask why we're doing what we're doing. And if we look at the start of today, one of the topics up there is types of stretch techniques. So there's so many different stretch techniques we can use. So why are we going to use the one that we're using? What's our intended agenda? So for the splits, for example, maybe static stretching will work, but I tend to find it doesn't for a lot of people. Tick. What shall we concern before introducing this mobility practice to elder past injuries? I think your biggest concern is actually going to be their willingness to give something like this a go. I think that's actually your biggest concern and your biggest hurdle to get over. Trying to find, especially when it comes to a parent-child relationship. I know no one in my family listens to me, whether it's blood relatives or like married relatives. So sometimes it's better coming through a different channel. Yeah, that would be my biggest thing. The other thing to think about is just start with very, very small ranges, because the thing is, you know, if we're starting with really small stuff, if we're starting with really small steps first, you know, and they're mastering it really quickly, it's very easy for us to progress very large from there. But if we start too large and they fall, you can't come back from that. So think small to large, grow off of their capabilities. One of my mentors when I was younger, a strength and conditioning coach who works with the Australian and British Olympic teams, he's got a saying that I love to teach the coaches that I teach, which is you need to have your clientele earn the right to progress. So how that relates to you right now in this scenario, if we're going to introduce this to our parents, we need them to earn the right to progress. So they don't have the right to start off with these big, great ranges of motion and great amounts of force through arm drivers and stuff. They're not allowed that first. They've got to earn the right to get to there. So we're going to start at the bottom, and you're going to earn that right to get to that next level each time. So that's the thing to take into account. So again, your biggest hurdle is going to be get them to buy into this, commit to it through you, and then just start small to go big, because it's very easy to go from here to here, but you can't come back down. Is there such a thing as a muscle knot? Oh, Rhett, you've opened up a fire. All right. Okay. If you go off of textbooks that are now dated and some of the courses I teach, we will tell you that yes, there is a muscle knot. You can call it a trigger point or a knot, or a cork, or there's a lot of different terms for it. But it'll be a physical kind of bump within a muscle that you feel that could be painful or not painful. Here's the issue that we have. Every single image, we've done biopsies of muscles and we can't find them. We've done ultrasound of live functioning muscles and we can't find them. So the problem we have with muscle knots or trigger points is that we know they exist because we can feel them and they have an impact on us. But when we try to biopsy the muscle or scan it to try to get greater insight and to find what's going on, we cannot find it. So what that tells me is that there's something going on, but our understanding of it is wrong or off. And we need to get better at it. So is there such thing as a knot? Yes, but not as we understand it. To say that there isn't one is just ludicrous because we can feel it. And it has an impact. But if you also work in a clinical setting, you'll know that those knots ever tend to go away. In fact, I've got quite a big one in my back, and it only really ever causes me pain when I'm stressed or really fatigued without sleep. Again, that's trivial and it's circumstantial as well, but they are there, but we don't have a great understanding of them. Personally, I think they're more nervous system related because I've got good results with using stimulatory techniques of the nervous system with it. I guess what I'll tell you is this: if you're trying to have a direct impact on any knots or trigger points that you have of yourself, do not believe anybody who says they have the way to fix it, because we don't know how to fix it. We don't even know what it is, really. So be skeptical, but be open. The reason I say be skeptical, again, is because we don't really have any definitive on it. And the definitive information that we had has now been kind of discredited. But at the same time, the reason why I'm sort of saying stay open to it as well is because the techniques that are out there have had a positive impact on some people. That's why they've gained traction. They work to some degree. So experiment. Don't invest heavily in one technique, either psychologically or financially. Explore, try for long enough. I talk about at least a 3-month investment, because that's enough time to give you great insight into what is working and what's not. And if it's not working, make changes and be okay with that, because you might find something straight away that works instantly, or you might go through almost every technique we have known from a clinical standpoint and still not find relief. So at least take some type of solace in knowing that you're not alone in this. Again, be skeptical, but also be open. I hope that helps, Rhett. If not, mate, shoot me a message and I'm more than happy to engage in that one further. Last one we got here, guys, from Mia. What's more important, mobility or flexibility? Both. Basically, one's static and one is dynamic. Flexibility is about how much range of motion we can get from that joint. And mobility is basically that joint in function, in a sense. So there's not one without the other. It's kind of like mobility, stability, or flexibility. Well, you need all of them. You know, it comes back to, you know, things like training. You can't just focus on one aspect of it and hope that it sort of has a carry-on effect to everything else. Everything's integrated. And you'll find that when you work on mobility, that'll have an impact on your flexibility, which, if done in the right way, will impact your stability. All of these things in a positive way. You work on stability, that's going to work on your strength and mobility. Again, it comes down to what techniques, methodologies do you use and why. But don't start to think in a priority hierarchy. When it comes to all these things that we try to attain, the things that are the most important are the things that are most important to you right now. You might have really poor mobility, but really good dynamic single leg stability. Okay, so we want to work on some mobility for you a little bit more and get those greater ranges access. The question is who and why and what we're going to use. But try not to look at things in an isolatory fashion. Trying to pull one thing out. I mean, it's the same as like what's more important, strength or cardiorespiratory conditioning. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And so I think that we need to start thinking that way a little bit more as well. Unfortunately, those people that have the loudest voices in the industry actually push these ways of thinking of, there's a simpler way to do it. This one trick will give you this result. And it's just not true. It's just not true. I mean, if it was true, the industry wouldn't be as expansive as it is, because that one thing would have worked. And so we wouldn't have needed everything else. So yeah, trying to think of things in exclusivity. So yeah, and then what's most relevant or important to you right now. Does that help, Mia? Perfect. All right, guys. I think that's it. Does anyone have any more questions? Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Guys, thank you so much for joining us today. It was my absolute pleasure to have you. Reach out to us, even reach out to me personally. I can send through anything that you guys want, and then I'll try to do a carry on to this next week as well, where we talk about deceleration and how that's going to impact things as well. Guys, it was a real pleasure to have you tonight. And morning as well. We got Singapore, the US, Scotland, Thailand, we're all over. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Ellen Mary, it was so good to see you girls. Guys, keep safe, keep sane, and hopefully I'll see you guys next week. Shoot me any questions too. My pleasure.
Thank
Have a great night, guys.
you, Rob.
Thank you.
My
Bye-bye.
pleasure. Bye, guys.
Bye, Rob.
Bye, guys.